Hello, Void and all who inhabit it. It's me. And this piece was recorded during the 2023 WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes. Without the labor of the writers and actors currently on strike, the movies being covered here today wouldn't exist. When examining how contemporary media may or may not be struggling to process shifting societal expectations, comedy, and by extension satire, is the best place to search for blatant examples. But glancing at the opposite end of the tension scale and examining examples in horror can also be illuminating. Both comedy and horror utilize tension to build up an inevitable release for the audience. Whether you're crying from laughter or from fear, the goal is to get you there by winding you up as much as possible. Today, I want to peel apart two films that are not only at both ends of the tension spectrum, but also show mainstream struggles to adapt as youth culture grows more progressive. This is also the second chunk to the two recent waves of commentary media I presented in the previous video, shows and films that dabble in the absurdity of performative progressive behavior, intentionally or otherwise. Bodies, Bodies, Bodies falls on the side of critiquing, rightfully so, the performance behind many people's newfound progressiveness, but with moments that dip so far into disdain that we move from satire to mockery while still claiming some semblance of critical commentary. On the flip side, They/Them joins a steadily increasing list of shows and movies that, while well-intentioned, are perhaps woefully unprepared to fold #diversity into their stories. I'm wondering, how does the struggle to wobble along the thin line between mocking performative actions and presenting actual political thought impact the potential messaging sent through either of these films and other pieces of media like them? As always, just because I'm using these films as examples doesn't mean you can't still enjoy them. I'm simply questioning what about them might not be successful from a social commentary perspective. Before we dive into that, though, y'all mind if I talk about genre real quick? Horror is unique in its ability to reflect contemporary fears. There is something plaguing society, or at least a section of it, that's directly mirrored in who the antagonist is and how they behave. Slashers of the 80s provide a really easy example of the fear of an ostracized other destroying an idyllic, often white, suburban peace. But there's also environmental fears as seen in zombie and apocalyptic movies. There's the state of the world reflected in the level of gore shown on screen. There's always something in the zeitgeist that can be amplified to terrify the audience. When we think about what's happening in our current unprecedented times, it's a bunch of shit going on. But for the scope of this video, woke has become a stand-in slur, identity politics can be watered down to tote bag slogans, and there's been an increase in media that pokes at both the willfully ignorant and the obnoxiously quote-unquote progressive alike. As a millennial who's been told I ain't shit more often than my alleged specialness has been uncritically praised, I recognize that part of this lamenting over progressive behavior is the regularly scheduled generational wave of belittling the youth. Part of it is also just racism. But I also wonder how much of this focus, this disdain of liberal or progressive talking points as explored in horror media, is rooted in this same pattern of magnifying a societal fear. Fear of what exactly is where things get interesting. I want to note that there are many social thrillers/horror films out there that tackle wide-set societal concerns, often oppressive systems, with a layer of commentary within the narrative. However, They/Them and Bodies, Bodies, Bodies aim towards the traditional slasher format of having a big bad personified metaphor terrorizing the cast. And although I think Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is closer to a murder mystery than a social thriller, let alone a horror, if horror is what these films claim to be, I think the label begs the question of what is the fear embodied by the antagonist? In my previous video, I brought up James E. Cameron's book, and specifically the third chapter, wherein he talks about satire as this aesthetic of political thought. We aren't trying to create large-scale societal change, but instead perhaps a shift in the mindset of the individual viewer, and sometimes not even that. Further in the book, however, Karen brings up the idea of questioning the limits of satire. What is the line between comic insult and actual insult? When does a piece shift from promoting social good through ridicule to simply being a rant? While Eat the Rich media is able to capitalize on a slogan entering public lexicon and use it as a foundation for weak political thought, media satirizing progressive mindsets, in my opinion, more often dip into couching actual insult as comic insult. Which brings us to Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. I know we just spent a couple of minutes talking about horror, but this film is both horror and comedy, so we do have to look at both sides. And in an attempt to have some semblance of a transition/connection to the last video, we're starting with the satire aspect. It's not that this film is the worst perpetrator of dipping too much into actual insult over comic insult in recent memory, but that, for better or for worse, Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is likely going to be the blueprint for a good 5 to 10 movies satirizing Gen Z moving forward. Despite the fact that the tone and some of the jokes and the whole setup and payoff can feel like a millennial in their mid-30s taking out their frustration that the kids on the Clock app said skinny jeans aren't the move anymore, the film can also be read as a commentary on our dependence on social media and on presenting ourselves in a way that's more favorable, more politically conscious than who we actually are. And it is doing that, right? Two things can be true. But to me, the actual insult took precedence over the comic insult a little too much. I felt that if the deeper point was going to be critiquing the fakeness and potential harm based in co-opting progressive talking points, that could have been better baked into all of these characters and the entire film, not just the one good scene that made rounds on Twitter for a month. I think sometimes we don't allow space to talk about both the really good things in a film and the possibility that the bulk of a film wasn't actually saying anything, or what it was saying was just insult. And like, every movie doesn't have to say something, right? Every movie doesn't need a message, but a satire does. Given that the killer is revealed to be the victim himself, having sliced his own neck open, how does the message of the film, of the satire, extend beyond the distrust embedded in one very flawed group of friends? There is, of course, the "that happened because you be on that phone" of it all, but Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is also presenting progressive people, or people attuned to progressive talking points, as shallow and unaware. I saw this post on Tumblr, of all places, about South Park, wherein a user said, "This show isn't satirizing conservatives, the show is satirizing those who care passionately about changing the world." I haven't watched enough South Park to have an opinion on that take, but what I did find interesting was this idea of media that on its face is mocking the extreme, the absurd, the out of touch, but at its core is perhaps promoting apathy, is saying if you try to make things better, you'll actually make them worse, or end up like one of these awful, obnoxious people. The other thing about this aspect of South Park, at least in what I've seen, and that was back when Chocolate Salty Balls was top 10 on the R&B charts, is that there's a moral at the end of the episode, and it's often relayed to the audience by Stan. As the grounded, more serious character, he serves as the comic foil to all the other shit that's going on. Stan keeps us on track, morality-wise, most of the time. B, as the antithesis to the friend group, serves a similar role in Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. But despite being the character who could show us a different perspective to how the others navigate the world, could maybe ground us in something solid, B is more of an observer than a participant in her own story. When you're making fun of the whole cast and the one grounded character is essentially a prop with lines, what message is the story grounded back in? And I'm not expecting like a character counts poster here, just questioning what we're supposed to find funny and how the roles of certain characters fit within that. As much as who we're laughing or screaming at can reflect society, so too does the character we're supposed to take seriously. These characters provide, if nothing else, a reaction to everything going on that highlights what opinion or mindset or moral the narrative is swinging towards. Take, for example, One Up, a movie about an all-girl competitive esports team. The film is a classic underdog story with an added access of marginalization. However, it is also not trying to be an after-school special. If you aren't one of the bigoted dickheads who review-bombed an admittedly mediocre film, you'd have seen that One Up pushes towards a more progressive mindset while also having a few jokes at the expense of those trying to be the most woke. And that both of these things are filtered through the protagonist and her bestie, who often serve as foils to the people around them. A really good example is how V and Sloane react to Dean Davis. Their initial meeting with him is really cringy, not because of the idea of inclusion, but because of how hard he is trying and failing to be inclusive. When Sloane tries to explain what triggered means, he cuts her off, says he doesn't actually care and is just going through the motions. Importantly, we are positioned to see him as laughable because of V and Sloane's reactions. A story could present someone like Dean Davis as someone to take seriously, as someone whose viewpoint is worth participating in, even if he is kind of goofy about it. But this story doesn't, because we're grounded in how V and Sloane are moving through the world. In this story about capital E empowerment, struggling to be more progressive isn't the issue. It's disingenuous interaction. Bodies, Bodies, Bodies does look at disingenuous interactions, but I'm once again wondering about B's function because I think her role tells us more about the story than just mocking the obnoxious. We are not supposed to be laughing at B. If anything, we're maybe set up to be afraid of her because on top of her willingness to get active, the film scratches at that nasty old trope of, oh, you have a history of mental health issues in your family? That's probably why you're violent. Which, yuck. Regardless, she's not the target of the comic insult. Yet as a foil, she's so passive that I was wondering what's the bigger picture point of her character, other than to be like, you rich kids are so annoying, and yet right next to you could be a real life poor person who actually has to work for a living. Be grateful. When we think of the film as a horror, and the fact that the big bad personified metaphor in the shadows is meant to reflect some greater fear, are we also meant to be afraid of the disconnected, chronically online kids we're laughing at? Is the possibility of becoming one of these disconnected and chronically online people horrifying? And if so, what's the alternative? Because again, B is little more than wallpaper with a questionable backstory. What does it say about the satire and the fear to have her basically disappear from the narrative? We'll come back to the fact that most of the characters in Bodies, Bodies, Bodies are rich and that is part of the story. For now, I just want to pocket the idea of a piece of media suggesting you, uppity progressive, are so holier than thou, and yet you're ignoring real issues and people with real issues, while simultaneously the film is kind of doing the same. Dean Davis is also a great example of the bumbling middle-aged man trying really hard to hold back the slurs archetype that can also be reflected in some creators' double-ended fear of being canceled while also being seen as out of touch. That desire to be up to date on all the lingo doesn't change the rotted ideals that need to be challenged in the first place. As a result, we can get people too focused on buzzwords than institutionalized issues in a self-preservation way instead of the self-promotional way poked at in Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. This fear of keeping up or getting cut is also how we get a film like They/Them, which was such a waste of a great title, I just want to say. The film has two competing antagonists, the conversion camp owner Owen, and subsequently all the camp counselors, and the mass killer stalking through the woods. When Nurse Molly, whose real name is Angie, is revealed to be the killer, we learn that she also attended the camp as a child. While she initially wanted retribution for her own torture, she now wants to close every conversion camp in the country by murder. In the end, the fear of the story is not personified in the morality monsters, in those who have justified the marginalization of others by way of moral code, but rather in the queer person revealed to be the vengeance-seeking killer, who the protagonist writes off as being just as bad as the first group of antagonists. Admittedly, I really struggled to understand what They/Them was afraid of and wanted us to be afraid of, especially given that none of the campers were harmed or remotely threatened by the killer, who is seen as the worst offender by the end. The when they go low, we go high of it all not only misses that people genuinely, horrifically act like the camp counselors, that the film has not created a uniquely exaggerated portrayal of trans and homophobia couched in a soothing layer of pleasantries that would make Angie's reaction absurd, but also pivots to suggest that the issue is revenge, as opposed to the conditions that led to someone seeking revenge in the first place. Also, the lone black boy is named Toby, and that just weird. Anyway, what does it mean to fear the queer person who wants to destroy the system within the parameters of a film that's claiming to care for queer people? Are we supposed to be afraid of those actively working to harm the LGBTQ plus community while hiding behind a veneer of kindness? Or are we supposed to be worried about the non-normative member of the community who will quote unquote lead us to violence? I don't think it is a safe nor smart decision to claim that the two are of equal concern. But they/them does so because the film's great fear is an inability to assimilate, whether that be due to sugar-coated bigotry or quote-unquote extremist fellow queer people. There's also a weird subplot late in the film that I can't put my finger on what about it is so fun, but I need to point it out. Stu, played by the same guy who played the dead baby angel in A New York Christmas Story, is this assimilist gay character presented as the most normative of the group, to the point of spewing transphobic and homophobic shit to his fellow campers. Late in the story, he ends up sleeping with Gabriel, a more androgynous camper who is revealed to actually be an employee whose sole role is to pretend to be a camper and lure unsuspecting teenagers into an even more vulnerable position so that they can be tortured through aversion therapy, which is exactly what happens to Stu. While the aversion therapy is obviously the bigger evil of the scene, how we get to this point is so questionable, so disgusting, that something about it is off. And again, I just need to talk about it. Pain and violence are tried and true horror ways of making statements about power and social norms in addition to playing on fear. But given that Stu is the only camper to be harmed, what social norms are we dabbling with? What power dynamic is being examined and having this assimilationist character lured into near death by a less normative character? The film does not take the time or the space to consider why somebody like Gabriel would do what he does. However, there is a way to read this in which if Angie is a quote-unquote failure of the camp, Gabriel could be seen as a quote-unquote success of the camp, where his conversion is so thoroughly completed that he comes out the other end, no pun intended, wanting to put other children through the same process that he went through and have a direct hand in that occurring, right? If we read Gabriel like that, of this shit was so successful on him that he just needs to spread the word. Even in reading him like that, to me, the root of the problem is not the marginalized person recreating harm, though that is an issue. It is the root of that harm, which is the bigoted puppet pulling master in the background. So when we're looking at this dynamic of who is the bigger issue, the harmed person who is recreating harm or redistributing harm if they're choosing like a different target, or the bigot who led to the harm in the first place, it's always going to be the bigot, baby. Always. Whether we're looking at Gabriel or Angie, it is possible to have an antagonist share the same axis of marginalization as the protagonist, and for that connection to be at the root of the conflict. The blackening just did that. However, the blackening works because ultimately the issue that drives the antagonist is intracommunal. The white people are tools for Clifton's violence, but the film ultimately isn't trying to tackle systemic racism and the limited quantifiers of blackness, just the latter. They/them tries to look at both a level of trans and homophobia so deeply embedded in society that there are camps negligent caretakers can toss their children in hopes of quote-unquote fixing them, and the erosive power of vengeance in a specific respectability politics kind of way. I think it's not just that the film needed to only tackle one subject, but that they also needed to understand that the two things they were poking at are not comparable levels of concern. They/them is dabbling in a flavor of fiction that is particularly queer, but this idea of positioning the more quote-unquote radical mindset as just as dangerous as the opposition isn't far-fetched when it comes to media that pokes at progressives. Being afraid of being too liberal or progressive or leftist or radical can lead to erring on the side of caution in a way that results in perpetuating harmful mindsets in the name of assimilation. Assimilation goes hand in hand with the fear of not keeping up. It's all rooted in staying connected to the mainstream. I've been intentionally using the term progressive throughout this video because I do think there is a very specific sanitized political performance that does deserve to be critiqued. However, this video is an unofficial part 2 because I also think there is a tendency to treat progressive people similarly to how movies about class treat the rich. And sometimes it's because the two are an overlapping circle. Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is low-key an Eat the Rich film. B serves a similar purpose to Margot in that she is the underwritten poor person who ends up stuck in some rich people nonsense. But a focus on how absurd these behaviors and people are, on how you can out-buzzword the buzzworder, has a limit. Similarly to dunking on wealthy people, is the point to just be glad we aren't as insufferable as these progressives? Maybe the answer is yes. However, by treating progressive characters and narratives with the same level of ire we would treat the wealthy, we flatten a range of people into this box of the very annoying progressive. Whether the function is to scold the woke scolder or to plead for acceptance from the hegemony, we build up this archetype of the progressive as whiny and sanctimonious and artificial, and then anyone who talks about anything within the realm of what a progressive would care about gets labeled as that archetype and treated accordingly. Again, it's not that these people don't exist and that critique isn't worthy. My worry is that we are equating value signalers, people who are politically pussy popping for brownie points, with people who are being genuine in their care as a way of discrediting both. As I said in the beginning, there's nothing about my analysis that's meant to suggest you cannot enjoy these pieces of media. But if your reaction is, oh no, I got politically corrected by the fun police, let me SSX tricky my ass into right-leaning ideology to soothe my wounded ego, there's maybe something else going on. And maybe your annoyance isn't so acidic, but my goal, as it often seems to be, is to ask what we're laughing at or afraid of, and why we are so determined to experience that emotion uncritically. At the end of the day, if we can't even stomach the introductory level stuff, if we aren't willing to be pushed an inch outside of our own comfort zone, how are we going to get to the mindsets and behaviors that will actually result in systemic change? If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. As I mentioned at the start of this video, this is being recorded during the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strike. There's more information and resources related to the strike linked in the description below. As of right now, reviews and analysis are still okay within the parameters of the strike, but should that change, I will halt my already inconsistent uploading schedule. If you can hear the ice cream man down the block, I am sorry. I didn't want to record in my closet today because it's hot. Anyway, how do you feel about these movies or other related pieces of media? How do you feel about the person speeding down the road, bro? Relax. I couldn't find a place to put it, but I think Max from Do Revenge and the new Velma show are also examples, good and bad, of how progressive mindsets can be bastardized, for lack of a better term. Also, the little girl from the Barbie movie, Sasha. I don't want to talk about Barbie. I literally the day it came out, I saw 4 videos, excellent videos. You should check them out. Verily Bitchy has one. Herbie, oh my goodness. Herbie has one. I think Princess Weeks is coming out with one. I believe Film Fatale has one. Great videos. So I don't want to talk about Barbie, but Sasha's character I thought was really interesting, especially because low-key, that's the target audience of the movie. Anyway, not talking about it. Okay, I think that is everything. Until next time, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.